I think we're at a moment within our planetary history, within our geologic history, our environmental history of our planet, where it's kind of an all hands on deck scenario. We need, it's not just artists, it's not just scientists, it's not just educators. We need everyone to take on some form of responsibility or at least some sort of agency and motivation.
Hey folks, thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. In past episodes, we've talked with Kiran Gandhi, aka Madame Gandhi, about turning Antarctic glacier recordings into popular electronic music, and with Arctic Ascent star Dr. Heidi Sevestre about glacier research and science communication. Today, in this episode, we're bringing those two areas together with environmental composer Konstantine Vlasis, who is studying the sound of glaciers in Iceland as a means to diagnose planetary health, and he's making music with what he records. As you'll hear in this episode, Konstantine is a super smart dude. In addition to being Leif Eiriksson Fellow and Fulbright-NSF Arctic Research Fellow, he is a Fulbright-National Geographic Award recipient and National Geographic Explorer. Although I'm not sure how many National Geographic Explorers have ever made musical instruments out of trees. In this episode, we talk about his research and music, how he made his way from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Iceland, and music as a medium for science communication. I've included in the show notes two videos we discussed, 2124 and A Song for Lost Trees, both of which are an absolute must-watch. As Konstantine points out at the end of the episode, we're in a moment of time when certain political leaders are trying to sow division and actively suppress both scientific and artistic progress, particularly when it comes to climate change. Now is actually the best time to forge new alliances and blur those lines with new collaborations across art and science. So with that in mind, I want to share a passage from a commencement address that the writer Terry Tempest Williams gave at the University of Utah way back in 2003. What does the open space of democracy look like? In the open space of democracy, there is room for dissent. In the open space of democracy, there is room for difference. In the open space of democracy, the health of the environment is seen as the wealth of our communities. We remember that our character has been shaped by the diversity of America's landscapes, and it is precisely that character that will protect it. Cooperation is valued more than competition. Prosperity becomes the caretaker of poverty. The humanities are not peripheral, but the very art of what it means to be human. Beauty is not optional, but essential to our survival as a species. And technology is not rendered at the expense of life, but developed out of our reverence for it. In the future, brave men and women will declare a declaration of interdependence that will be read and honored alongside the Declaration of Independence, proof of our evolution, revolution of our own growth and understanding. The open space of democracy provides justice for all living things and extends our notion of community to include plants, animals, rocks, and rivers, as well as human beings. It is a landscape that encourages diversity and discourages conformity. If you enjoy this episode of Ecosystem Member or any of our past episodes, please take a minute to give us a rating on your preferred podcast platform or a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching. This small action goes a long way in telling the platforms that they should help people find the Ecosystem Member podcast, which I hope you agree with. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member podcast with environmental composer Konstantine Vlasis. Today on the Ecosystem Member podcast, we are really excited to be joined by Konstantine Vlasis, environmental composer and audio researcher. Thanks for joining us today, Konstantine.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rick. Excited to be here.
So your work is really interesting. I'll include a link in the show notes to some of the stuff on YouTube, which some amazing videos, some amazing scenery in Iceland that you're engaging with your work. So maybe just to start us off, can you give us a little bit of an overview on what you work on as an environmental composer and sort of the research that you're doing around listening to glaciers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just here at the outset, I really appreciate your questions. I think the material you sent me is It's really nice when people engage with your work and then have meaningful questions about them. So thanks for that, Rick. So I'm an environmental composer, audio researcher. I'm really interested in the relationship between natural sounds and composed music and what we consider to be natural sounds or music. And so for me, there's almost this three-part relationship between sound, music, and listening. So, sort of the act of listening as the way that we often perceive or engage with both sound and music. And so, as a composer, I'm really interested in that three-part relationship and the ways that sound, music, and listening mediate our relationships with the natural world or, more than human entities. And so that kind of leads me into my research with glaciers and glacial sounds. I'm really interested in documenting the diversity of sounds that glaciers create and trying to better understand what's happening within glacial landscapes to produce those sounds. And then to approach my experience and interest with music as a means for climate communication and environmental storytelling. So, yeah, that's just kind of maybe a broad overview of what I'm interested in and some of the ideas that I'm engaging with my research and my work.
Fantastic. I love this idea of listening as another dimension to this sort of relationship we have with nature and the more than human world, being everything is often visual, and listening. Sometimes I think when people think of the more than human world, whether it be sort of other animals who make sounds and have sort of their version of language, or things like glaciers, and listening to glaciers is another sort of like data input, is really interesting that sometimes I guess gets overlooked. So like to that point, like what when you're listening to these glaciers, what do they sound like? Can you help someone who's maybe never stood next to a glacier, or maybe even people who have but just haven't been paying attention to the sounds? What does a glacier sound like?
Yeah, I really love this question. And a lot of people that I end up interviewing for my research, I ask them this very question. And, everyone has a different answer to what a glacier sounds like. And I think it's important to recognize that glaciers produce a diversity of sounds. And I think this is, before I kind of dive into what a glacier sounds like, maybe just recognizing that a glacier is not just a mass of ice. A glacier is a mass of ice that moves. Every movement creates a sound, and every sound essentially tells a story about what a glacier is, how it functions, and why it's changing so rapidly today. So, you could think that glaciers are inherently sonorous. So, again, not just visual landscapes, but as masses of ice that move, glaciers are masses of ice that sound. Do you want to listen to some of those sounds? So the first sound sample that you're hearing is the actual shifting of ice. So a glacier is a mass of ice that moves downslope under its own weight. And so even though you can't see a glacier move in real time, you can hear it move in real time. And so the kinds of microphones I'm using in this recording are kind of specialty contact microphones, but often if you're out on the ice walking on its surface, you'll be able to hear some of this cracking and shifting sounds. And so there's just lots of different aspects of the actual mass itself where it has different densities or kind of the topography beneath the ice is doing different things. And so this is what partly causes that shifting and cracking and rumbling sound that you're hearing right now. Another sample that I'll share is the sound of meltwater streams. And the way I've kind of played this recording, you'll hear kind of four different almost like filters of the audio. And what I've done is I'm at a particular site on the ice, recording a meltwater stream, and it's pulling in what's called a moulin. So this is like ice, or this is like streams that flow across the surface of a glacier that will start to pool together and then begin to melt the ice vertically and create these kind of holes and create a whole kind of like terrace system of meltwater caverns. And so what you're hearing in the recording is the supraglacial meltwater stream, the surface layer stream. Then you'll hear an inglacial stream that runs through the ice. And then below that, you'll hear another layer of inglacial stream. So you'll start to hear all these meltwater streams pulling together within the ice itself to create all these meltwater caverns. So you'll kind of start at the surface and move down into the ice. So that's sounds really cool. And then the final recording that I can share is actually the sound of glacial air. So in its early formation, glacial ice is 40% air. And this is because glacial ice forms from the accumulation of snow at its summit. And so it will compress down and melt, and the snow will try to adjust to its new environment and new temperatures, and this will compact down and create firn and then eventually create ice. But in between those snowflakes and eventually the ice crystals, you have like air that becomes trapped in between them. And I love this recording in particular because maybe you've heard some of these sounds before. There's other musicians and sound artists that have created some really amazing pieces where you can hear the crackling of this air. And the way that you record glacial air is by submerging a hydrophone in some body of water where the ice is floating. So then as the ice fragment melts, the air is escaping from the ice fragments and has all these clicks and pops and fizzes. But you'll also hear squealing or kind of small melodies. And this is because the glacial air is never just perfect spheres, like perfect air bubbles. The air bubbles often are stretched and kind of compressed in crazy different, like wild shapes within the ice fragment. And what that is just a history of how the ice has flowed down slope over time. So as the ice compresses or pulls apart, those air bubbles will compress together and then pull apart. And so then when it melts, you have these really weird indentations of the ice that release the air in really amazing ways. And it almost sounds like birdsong or singing or just some really wild sounds, but it's pretty amazing what you're actually hearing is the flow of ice, kind of the history that's then given to us in sound, which is pretty amazing.
It reminds me of on a past episode, we had the musical artist Madame Gandhi, Kiran Gandhi, on our podcast, and she did some recordings with glaciers, and it was interesting. I was asking her about what her expectations were going on these expeditions. I think she's been to record glaciers. She was in the rainforest in the Amazon, I think, before we recorded with her. And I asked her sort of what her expectations were going into it and then what she actually uncovered. And, I think she said she thought she was going to like encounter a polar bear and be able to like capture the roar of a polar bear. And then that was what her sound was going to be. But then kind of to your point, your exact point here is like when she started recording the glaciers and she had built a hydrophone and captured these sounds, she was just amazed by the complexity of sounds that she was able to get out of it. So in your case, did you have an expectation of what you would hear? Like, did you have enough, I guess, scientific or musical knowledge that you knew what would probably happen? Or was it sort of like we're just going to try this out and see what comes of it? Like, what expectations and then what reality did you have in making these recordings?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rick. I mean, I think, you go in sort of, I mean, I had done research about sound art and field recording techniques surrounding glaciers for some time. I had listened to recordings from other artists and other audio researchers. And so I guess those were, kind of informing, those experiences were informing my expectations. But I mean, I'm always surprised when I'm out in the field recording and continue to be surprised. I mean, the glaciers in Iceland specifically, because they're temperate glaciers, they're extremely dynamic in terms of changes in weather or seasons or air temperature, and so they're just really dynamic landscapes. And so the sounds that they produce in any given location or any given season, they're equally dynamic. So I feel I'm still surprised and still learning so much, even 2 years, after starting this work.
It's super interesting. I was in Iceland a few years ago and did like a ice cave, sort of glacial cave tour. And it was the one in the south. I do not know how to pronounce it, but it's kind of the famous one in the south that was one of the largest ones in Europe, or might still be the largest one in Europe. And when we went through, our tour guide sort of showed us where the edge of the glacier was, like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, as we were walking to enter the cave. And like part of that dynamism, I imagine, is the fact that these glaciers are melting. And I think in some of it was either another interview or something you had written, you talked about how Iceland's glaciers are expected to disappear, I guess, or vanish in the next like 200 years. So is that part of when you're going into these recordings, is like part of it understanding this dynamism and these changes as it relates to climate change? Is that like part of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for this question, Rick. And for me, there's kind of like two parts to your question. One is sort of the direct experience of glaciers and glacial sounds in the context of climate change or environmental change. And then the other part is, how does my work fit within that? Maybe is that right?
Yeah,
Cool.
perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of my own work, this is something that I feel really called to do as an artist, as a researcher. How can I use my own passions and my skills to be part of this conversation? Whether it's public awareness, whether it's trying to offer people a sense of wonder surrounding the natural world, whether it's helping translate scientific data to reach wider audiences, or perhaps motivate policy change or political action. So this is certainly a really strong motivation for me as an artist and in my own work, is finding ways for, how can music be a means for climate communication? How can music be a means for environmental storytelling, especially in the face of how rapidly these landscapes are changing? And I think the other part of this is what you were asking about, the kind of direct experience of these landscapes and your own experience of going to an ice cave in Vatnajökull and having the tour guide, sort of point out in the landscape where this ice used to be 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. Um, and it is difficult, right? I think for most people to, when those histories are pointed out and when that kind of rate of environmental change is pointed out, then you're kind of simultaneously experiencing this amazing, wondrous, beautiful part of our world, while at the same time bearing witness and kind of viscerally experiencing its disappearance and its loss. And I think that's this kind of this oscillation between aesthetic fascination and maybe eco anxiety is something that I will often feel during field recording excursions, or especially if I'm going to the same site multiple times, once a month or something like this. And I think that it's something that, um, you know, our societies and our experiences of environments in general, I think we're all kind of facing this, that they're rapidly changing. Perhaps glaciers are a really visceral example because they are so visual and have these kind of uh, you know uh, they move front and back and up and down, and so they give us this really visceral experience of change. But I think this is all something that we're all grappling with in some way.
And it's interesting. You kind of talked there about a couple of things around like science communication, using the data to communicate musically, sort of what's going on, but also sort of your recording and the direct experience of that and helping bring that to people and raise that awareness. So when you go into a recording, or maybe when you're working with data from other researchers around glaciers, like what do you think we can learn from listening to this data, or direct experience listening to like the actual sounds that are coming off of the glacier? Like what are you hoping to communicate, I guess, about that through your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe one of the things I'm trying to do is, yeah, embrace music composition or creative practice or just kind of audio-based research in general, the methods of going out to record sounds and document them. Trying to build experiences for people both of glaciers themselves, but also how they're changing over time. So, for example, one of the things I've done for a current project that I'm working on is to go to ice caves over the course of a year, go to the same location, and record the acoustics of the ice cave. So, being able to record and then measure kind of resonant frequencies of the space and things like that, and then be able to create reverb filters um, and and then run particular sounds through these filters so that people can listen to how the acoustics of the this one particular location can change in just 365 days. So that's one thing I'm doing that I think kind of helps translate my own direct experience of a landscape for listeners, even though they're not able to be there in person, and be able to communicate that rate of change. The other one is trying to use data sets and trying to use a technique called data sonification. So rather than taking a data set and creating a visual representation of that data, like a graph with an XY axis or something like this, I'll create some sort of audio texture. And so for me, my background and training is in percussion, so I'm really fascinated by rhythm and tempo and things like this. So this is often what I'll work with, not only because I have a interest and a passion in those kind of musical textures and techniques, but also because I think rhythm and tempo can help communicate specifically the rate of change of glaciers and environmental change in general. I think one of the pieces that you listened to before our interview was 2124. And so that really just kind of turns a data set into a metronome. And so it allows a listener to experience or listen to the rate of change that will occur over the next 100 years, or kind of the projected data of how a particular outlet glacier will change over the next 100 years. So these are both kind of different techniques that I'm using. Some are more centered on my own direct experience of a landscape, and others are just trying to represent scientific data in creative ways, but also clear ways and maybe motivating ways.
So two questions that came out of it, and I'll keep them separate just for simplicity's sake. But the first one is like, what do your methods look like? So when you're going to this field site and you're going to the same one, once a month for however long, or once every few, whatever the cadence is, like, are you sort of strapping on some crampons and like have a huge backpack? Are you just out there with like your smartphone using the mic on that? Like what give us a little bit of a visual of like what we could see if somebody happened upon you trekking to a recording site.
Yeah, I mean, definitely layers, layers and layers. If you see me out in the field in Iceland near a glacier, I've got, my lining and I've got my base layers and my shell. But I've got a small portable, like a Zoom, it's a Zoom F6 field recorder. And so I run all my mics off of this device. It works really great. And it really just depends on what site I'm going to. So, what part of the glacier am I traveling to? Most of my work ends up happening near the terminus of a glacier, just because it's the most accessible area. The summit, it takes a bit more effort and tech and funding to get to the top in a super Jeep or something like this. Um, and so, yeah, I've got my crampons, I've got my ice axe, I've got my helmet and harness, I've got my, medical pack, I've got my safety rope and gear, and then all of the audio equipment that I'm using. And so, depending on what side I'm going to, I have mic stands, I have multi microphones, sometimes directional, cardioid, sometimes ambisonic. I've got hydrophones, I've got the tiny audio mouths that I can leave out for months at a time. And then I've also got specialty contact microphones. Loam has a really amazing geophone, which is like a really powerful contact microphone, essentially. But so yeah, if you, it'll look like I'm a glacier guide plus a bunch of audio gear.
Awesome, awesome. Hopefully, I'm really hoping somebody listens to this and like tags you in a picture and tags us in a picture of like finding you out on a glacier somewhere with all of your stuff set up. Kind of probably wondering what's going on if they haven't listened yet. But so the other question that I wanted to ask you is, and I apologize in advance. As much as I love Iceland, I am very bad at pronunciation. So, Iceland has like this interesting tradition of musical artists, especially modern musical artists who involve nature in one way or another in their music. So Bjork, for sure, she just like did an amazing installation in Paris at one of the museums in Paris that involved sort of more than human language and more than human sounds. And then you've got Olafur Arnolds. Is that close enough for you to recognize what I'm talking
Yeah.
about? He did this amazing ocean sound, which involved, I think, recording oceans off the coast somewhere in England as part of it. And then Sigur Rós, I found one, like an album that they did of a recording with 66 North that had like, was at a specific geolocation. Like, is there something about Iceland that like field recording and integrating nature and music goes so well together that so many of these like world famous artists are bringing it to people? Like, is there something about the culture? Is there anything you've learned through the process that makes it unique or different, or taking this approach in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this question. I think it's in part a complicated question. I think on the one hand, um, I mean, of course, the natural landscape in Iceland is unique and it's extremely dynamic and has played a really important role in people's lives for a long time, um, ever since the time of settlement. And and I think that, this could also be said of almost any place as well. And so I think one danger is that just because artists and really popular artists have been inspired by nature and the natural landscape of Iceland, um, I feel one danger is just kind of making a statement that all Icelandic music is then infused with some element of nature or the natural world or something like this. And this relates to kind of music marketing, like the industry and how that's sort of wrapped up in ecotourism industries as well. How, some artists have uh, sort of their managers or the music industry professionals will encourage artists to record music videos in the landscape itself,
Justin
or
Bieber. You might be
Yeah,
hinting.
things like this. And so, I certainly think that um, a lot of the musical activism or inspiration from the natural world is extremely significant and powerful and personal to each artist or group, but that there is, I think, a danger in just classifying all Icelandic music in this way. And
Hmm.
so it's something that I've grappled with in my own work as well, because I'm have been looking into and trying to find traditional Icelandic songs that talk about glaciers, that mention glaciers, and analyze them as kind of sources for environmental knowledge or just like a snapshot of how people have understood or valued glaciers in different moments throughout history. And so I'm I feel like I'm constantly asking myself this very question all the time. But of course, Björk and Sigur Rós, a lot of their work surrounding the natural landscape. If you look back to interviews from, the late 90s and early 2000s, almost every interviewer asked them about their relationship to nature and things like that. And this is a big part of a colleague, Tura Storvald's book, Dissonant Landscapes, is really talking about this dynamic. But also there were, using these artists using music as a way to rethink ecological relationships as a form of environmental activism is certainly a really powerful approach to music composition and performance.
I read that you're from Chattanooga, Tennessee, or at least somewhere in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Um, I've only been to Tennessee a few times, but how did you end up researching and sort of creating this music and doing this research in Iceland? Like, give us an overview of how you got from point A to B.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll try to keep it, to the short version here. So I don't, not gonna have the episode as my life story here, but um, yeah, I mean, growing up in East Tennessee, so Chattanooga, it's often called the Scenic City. It's positioned in the Tennessee Valley, in between Lookout and Signal Mountains. Tennessee River runs through it. There's a really strong outdoor community, tons of outdoor events and activities to participate in. And so growing up, even in my small suburban neighborhood, I was always spending time outside. And once I got out of the city proper, would grow up and spending a lot of time in the Upper Cumberland, Smoky Mountains as well. Van Buren County, state parks in that area. So I think I fell in love with natural sounds in East Tennessee growing up and just spending time outdoors. I mean, as someone who loves recording and post-production audio work and that sort of process, I think, the most powerful and significant way to connect with natural soundscapes and the natural world is to go be a part of it or listen, the kind of having that direct experience. It was definitely formative for me. So that's kind of my relationship with maybe some of the natural landscapes of Tennessee, but also my early music career as well. So band programs, percussion. My middle school had a percussion ensemble, so I was kind of playing drums by fourth grade. So just both falling in love with sound and music from an early age was really formative for me. And fast forward, early 2000s, and I think like a lot of people, I was infatuated with the music of Sigur Rós. And so I was just sort of always curious about Iceland and always wanted to travel there. And so in 2015, I came to Iceland. That was my first time visiting Iceland, and was interested in figures like Sigur Rós and Björk and of Monsters and Men later on, and but was also interested in Icelandic music, older genres. What is traditional Icelandic music? And so in 2015, that kind of began this decades long interest in these older genres and songs and singing styles. And at some point, I started to analyze the poetry of these songs or sort of trace their history to particular places, and just became really interested in the ways that the poetry itself would talk about the landscape or the natural world, especially at different style periods. So how the poetry and songs would also change, how different genres at different moments in time would depict nature in different ways. And so at some point, just started looking into songs that mentioned glaciers and talked about glaciers. And yeah, that kind of became the foundation for my current work and current interest, both as a composer and as a audio-based researcher.
Fantastic. That's super cool. I mean, I think some of those experiences as a young person end up being so formative. And it's like a Kierkegaard quote, you must live forward, but you can only understand looking backwards. It all seems to make sense now being in Tennessee and these nature sounds. But then it's like, how did I end up in Iceland? Like you mentioned, one of the videos I was watching was your 2124 video. And there's another video, I think it was called A Song for Lost Trees, where you'd sort of kind of created instruments with the trees. This is a really cool video. We'll definitely include a link to it in the show notes. So how do you view that relationship? You know, you talked about in the early media days of Soros and Bjork and asking this question about their relationship with nature. I mean, it's a huge part of your research and your work. Like, how do you view your relationship with nature? And also, I guess part of that is that tension that you mentioned of like seeing these places change immediately. Does that influence how you view that relationship with nature and the more than human world?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rick. I think on the one hand, I really try to break down any strict division between humans and nature or nature and culture. Um, I really try to point at this division that really seems to pervade kind of Western modern thinking and I think in both pieces that comes across in different ways. Um, in A Song for Lost Trees, the soundscape is kind of the foundational music texture, or at least for me it is. And and if you listen closely, it becomes hard to discern the sounds of the wind with the sounds of air traffic overhead or the sounds of vehicles passing nearby just outside of the tree line. And so I think even just trying to listen for those differences or the blending of them, the way that sound kind of functions ontologically, especially in that space, it kind of crosses those boundaries and those divisions that we have with what we are experiencing as this natural forest landscape with anthropogenic noise pollution or something like that. So I think in my own work, I'm really trying to prod at that division a bit. Um, at the same time, I think that there is autonomy and agency for more than human entities or the non-human world. And so, yeah, the way, at least for A Song for Lost Trees, you bring up these instruments we built. And that's in part trying to give some sort of autonomy or agency for the trees or just trying to incorporate them within our ensemble membership. So they're, all the pitches that we worked with were sort of dictated by the orientation of the tree branches. And then there's moments where the wind will blow and the trees will sway, and so you'll get these pitch bends with the guitar strings. They'll gain and lose tension. So of course that's kind of outside of our hands as well. So really looking for ways where trying to kind of break down these divisions between what we consider human and nature, while at the same time trying to amplify voices of more than human others or something like this is what I try to grapple with in my work.
And that is sort of a perfect segue. So to sort of bring our conversation to a close, like sort of a big question that kind of touches on a few things that we talked about. And I think in particular, this idea of divisions that you've just talked about and like artificial divisions or maybe divisions that aren't always useful. So you work at the intersection of art and science, like composition and creating music, also researching and importing data or creating your own data sets through the recordings that you do. Like, I think it's one thing that we've talked to a lot of people we've had on the podcast of like this importance of art and science coming together. How do you think about bringing the art and science together? Like, how do you create division in certain ways? Do you blur division in other ways? Like, what do you think about living at that intersection of art and science?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, this is a great question. And I think for me, the even more, maybe more significant than the division or the hyphen between art science is that third word that comes after art science collaboration. So for me, trying to use my own work to bring communities, bring people together, bring different disciplines together. This is what I'm really interested in. And I feel I've learned, I think a lot of artists or a lot of scientists even, they'll kind of turn to each other and think, well, what can I offer? What can I do? And maybe scientists are, at least a lot of the scientists I've worked with in Iceland have spoken to the desire to work with artists and trying to help communicate what their data is telling them or what the data is communicating. And I think that there's also kind of the reverse as well that, I have learned so much from working with scientists and I've gained so much in my own approach and methods. So rather than maybe reifying a division or blurring a division, I'm more interested in just ways that we can work together over a shared concern. And I think that this is one joy of interdisciplinary work or cross-disciplinary work is not that those are maybe sexy keywords in the world of academia right now, but just that we're trying to find ways to work together over shared concerns. I think we're at a moment within our planetary history, within our geologic history, our environmental history of our planet, where it's kind of an all hands on deck scenario. We need, it's not just artists, it's not just scientists, it's not just educators. We need everyone to take on some form of responsibility or at least some sort of agency and motivation, um, and or at least in my opinion. And maybe to end my quote here, it's or my answer here, I just want to once again say thank you, Rick, for having me on, and thanks for curating the Ecosystem Member podcast. I think this is one of those contributions and one of these means of creating a space over a shared concern that I find really inspiring and powerful. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for being a part of it. I when I first came upon your work, and we'll mention and highlight all of the recognitions that you've got. You've been quite humble in not bringing many of those up, but National Geographic and Fulbright, fellow, like you're doing some amazing, important, really interesting work, and I think, like you said, the more that we can see like less division and sort of come together over this shared, in a lot of ways, I think it's an opportunity. Like this could be a thing that brings us all together, to work on something that's, so much bigger than any one of us or even any percentage of us could just work on alone. So I think people are really going to enjoy hearing about your work. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rick. Thanks for having me. And maybe just one final clip, if you can kind of choose to use it or not. But I also just want to say that to be able to, um, how do I want to say this? At a time when our political system in the United States seems to be attacking both the arts and sciences, it has given me an extreme sense of agency to continue this work and to pursue this work. And so if there's anyone listening who's interested in art science collaboration, or who is kind of concerned about pursuing their own work in the face of these administrative decisions, please reach out to me. I would love to make contact. We can still create those spaces and still pursue this work together. So I just want to send that out into the world as well.